Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're exploring a case that shook the quiet neighborhood of Ridgewood, Queens, in July 2025. This is the tragic story of Anna Pilatagsima and her 2-year-old daughter, Annalise Cruz, a tale that reminds us how darkness can lurk behind closed doors, even in the most ordinary of homes. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves domestic violence and the loss of innocent life. While we approach these cases with respect for the victims and their families, we also recognize the importance of understanding the warning signs and circumstances that lead to such devastating outcomes. Ridgewood, Queens, sits at the border between Queens and Brooklyn, a working-class neighborhood where tree-lined streets are dotted with modest homes and small apartment buildings. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names, where children play in front yards, and where the sounds of daily life, lawnmowers, car doors closing, the distant hum of conversation, create a familiar urban symphony. On Forest Avenue, a residential street that could be found in any number of American neighborhoods, stood a house that would become the center of one of the most disturbing domestic violence cases New York City had seen in recent memory. The address, 63-35 Forest Avenue, was home to what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary family: Ernesto Cruz, a 54-year-old man, his 41-year-old wife Anna Alexandra Pilatagsima, and their bright-eyed 2-year-old daughter, Annalise. Anna, known to friends and family simply as Anna, had built a life in this diverse Queens community. At 41, she was in the prime of her life, navigating the joys and challenges of motherhood while maintaining the delicate balance that so many working mothers know all too well. Those who knew her described a woman devoted to her young daughter, someone who found meaning in the small moments, bedtime stories, playground visits, the countless tiny rituals that make up the fabric of family life. Little Annalise, at just 2 years old, was at that magical age where every day brings new words, new discoveries, new ways of seeing the world. She was beginning to form her own personality, to assert her independence in the way that toddlers do, with equal measures of stubbornness and charm. She was a child full of potential, with decades of life stretching ahead of her, birthdays to celebrate, schools to attend, dreams to pursue. The family lived together in their Ridgewood home, part of a community where Spanish could be heard as often as English, where the aroma of cooking from a dozen different cultures might drift from kitchen windows on any given evening. It was a neighborhood of immigrants and first-generation Americans, of people who had come to New York seeking better lives for themselves and their children. But behind the walls of 63-35 Forest Avenue, a different story was unfolding, one that would culminate in a horrific act of violence that would shatter not only this family, but ripple outward to traumatize a community and leave investigators struggling to understand how a father could commit such an unthinkable act. Saturday evening, July 19, 2025, began like countless other weekend evenings in Queens. The summer heat was beginning to ease as the sun made its way toward the horizon, and families throughout Ridgewood were settling into their weekend routines. Children were being called in for dinner, televisions were flickering on, and the pace of life was slowing to that comfortable weekend rhythm. Inside the Forest Avenue home, however, something was terribly wrong. At approximately 7:09 in the evening, a 911 call was placed to the New York Police Department. The caller was not someone from inside the house on Forest Avenue, but rather a young man calling from another location entirely, a nephew of Ernesto Cruz who had just witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. This nephew had been participating in what should have been a routine FaceTime call with his uncle Ernesto. Video calls between family members have become commonplace, especially in immigrant communities where relatives are often scattered across different cities, states, or even countries. It's a way to maintain connections, to share in each other's lives despite the distance, to let grandparents see grandchildren grow up, to keep the bonds of family strong. But this FaceTime call would become something else entirely, a horrific window into domestic violence at its most extreme, a technological connection that would transform a family member into an unwilling witness to murder. The nephew, whose name has been withheld by authorities to protect his privacy and mental health, found himself watching in real time as his uncle Ernesto committed acts of violence so shocking that the young man immediately called 911. Through the small screen of his device, he witnessed his uncle attacking Anna and little Annalise with a kitchen knife, stabbing them repeatedly before turning the weapon on himself. Police officers from the 104th Precinct responded to the Forest Avenue address within minutes of receiving the call. When they arrived at the scene, they found a house that looked utterly ordinary from the outside, the kind of home that thousands of families throughout Queens call their own. There was nothing about the exterior that would have suggested the horror that lay within. But as officers entered the residence, they discovered a scene that would test even the most experienced investigators. Inside the home, they found 3 people, all suffering from stab wounds. Anna lay critically injured, having suffered multiple stab wounds to her neck and chest. The 41-year-old mother had been attacked with such violence that investigators would later determine she had been stabbed 18 times, with 6 of those wounds piercing her heart. The medical examiner's findings would paint a picture of an assault that was not just deadly, but sustained and brutal, an attack that spoke to a level of rage that is difficult for most people to comprehend. Anna's injuries were not the result of a momentary loss of control or a single violent act, but rather a prolonged assault that demonstrated a determination to kill. The nature and number of her wounds suggested that this was not a crime of sudden passion, but something more calculated and deliberate. Beside her mother lay 2-year-old Annalise Cruz, the innocent child who had been caught in the violence that consumed her home that evening. The toddler had suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck, injuries that were immediately life-threatening to someone so small and vulnerable. At an age when children should be protected from even the minor dangers of daily life, Annalise had become the victim of the most extreme violence imaginable. Both Anna and Annalise were rushed to Elmhurst Hospital in critical condition, their lives hanging in the balance as medical professionals worked desperately to save them. But the injuries they had sustained were too severe, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, both mother and daughter were pronounced dead. The loss of Anna represented not just the death of a mother, but the destruction of all the hopes and dreams that she carried, the plans she had made for her daughter's future, the birthdays they would never celebrate together, the milestones of childhood that Anna would never witness. At 41, she was in the midst of her life's most important role, guiding and nurturing her young daughter through those crucial early years of development. The death of 2-year-old Annalise was particularly heartbreaking, representing the loss of pure potential. This was a child who would never have the chance to experience the full richness of life, never attend school, never make friends, never discover her talents and interests, never grow up to pursue her own dreams and ambitions. Her life ended before it had truly begun, cut short by violence in the place where she should have been safest. Also found in the home was Ernesto Cruz, suffering from what appeared to be self-inflicted stab wounds to his chest. The 54-year-old man was conscious when police arrived, but his condition was serious enough that he required immediate medical attention. He was transported to NYC Health Plus Hospitals/Elmhurst, where medical professionals worked to stabilize his condition. Cruz's survival raised immediate questions about his intentions. Had he attempted suicide after killing his wife and daughter, only to have second thoughts? Had his self-inflicted wounds been intended as a fatal gesture that he was unable to complete? Or was there some other explanation for why he had survived when his victims had not? In the days following the attack, investigators would piece together more details about what had occurred in that Forest Avenue home. The picture that emerged was one of a man who had planned his actions to some degree, choosing to involve his nephew as a witness through the FaceTime call. This detail was particularly disturbing to investigators and prosecutors, as it suggested a level of premeditation and a desire to ensure that someone would witness his actions. The fact that Cruz had called his nephew and initiated a video call before beginning his attack raised questions about his state of mind and his motivations. Was this a cry for help that went tragically wrong? Was it an attempt to ensure that his actions would be discovered quickly? Or was it something more sinister, a desire to traumatize a family member by forcing them to witness the murders? Cruz's refusal to speak to detectives after his arrest only deepened the mystery surrounding his motivations. In many domestic violence cases, perpetrators eventually provide some explanation for their actions, whether it's claims of infidelity, financial stress, mental health issues, or other factors that they believe justify their behavior. But Cruz remained silent, leaving investigators and the public to speculate about what had driven him to commit such a horrific act. In the days following the murders, the NYPD's investigation began to reveal the full scope of the violence that had occurred in the Forest Avenue home. Detectives processed the crime scene with the meticulous care that such cases require, documenting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a timeline of events. The medical examiner's findings provided crucial details about the nature of the attack. The 18 stab wounds inflicted on Anna, with 6 penetrating her heart, painted a picture of sustained violence that went far beyond what would have been necessary to cause death. This level of violence suggested extreme rage or a determination to ensure that his victims could not survive. The wounds suffered by 2-year-old Annalise were equally devastating, though investigators were careful to limit public discussion of the specific details out of respect for the child's memory and the sensitivities of the case. What was clear was that the little girl had suffered multiple life-threatening injuries that had caused her death. The fact that the murders had been witnessed via FaceTime added a unique and disturbing element to the case. The nephew who had made the 911 call became a crucial witness, though the psychological trauma he had suffered as a result of witnessing the murders raised questions about his ability to provide testimony and the long-term impact on his mental health. Cruz's recovery from his self-inflicted wounds allowed investigators to proceed with the criminal case, though his refusal to cooperate limited their ability to understand his motivations. On July 21, 2025, just 2 days after the murders, Cruz was formally arrested at his hospital bedside and charged with murder and criminal possession of a weapon. The charges against Cruz reflected the severity of his alleged crimes. He faced 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon, charges that carried the possibility of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz announced that Cruz had been indicted on charges of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and weapon possession. The decision to pursue first-degree murder charges was significant, as this charge is reserved for the most serious cases and carries the harshest penalties under New York law. The indictment process moved forward despite Cruz's refusal to cooperate with investigators. The evidence in the case was substantial: the FaceTime witness, the crime scene evidence, the medical examiner's findings, and Cruz's presence at the scene with self-inflicted wounds all pointed to his guilt. District Attorney Katz's statement reflected the community's shock and grief over the murders. New York City mourns the 2-year-old child and mother who were stabbed to death in their own home. Her words captured the sense of loss that extended far beyond the immediate family to encompass the broader community that had been traumatized by the violence. The legal proceedings raised questions about Cruz's mental state at the time of the murders and his competency to stand trial. While these evaluations are routine in cases involving such extreme violence, Cruz's silence made it difficult for mental health professionals to assess his condition or understand his motivations. The murders of Anna Pilotagsimapazita and Annalise Cruz occurred against the backdrop of a broader epidemic of domestic violence in the United States. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, approximately 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States, and domestic violence affects millions of Americans each year. The case highlighted several troubling patterns that are common in domestic violence situations. The fact that the violence occurred within the home, the place where victims should feel safest, reflects a reality that advocates have long recognized: home can be the most dangerous place for victims of domestic abuse. The presence of a child victim in this case was particularly heartbreaking, as children are often caught in the crossfire of domestic violence. According to statistics from the National Domestic Violence Hotline, children are present in homes where domestic violence occurs in approximately 60% of cases, and these children suffer both direct physical abuse and psychological trauma from witnessing violence against their caregivers. The extreme nature of the violence in this case, the 18 stab wounds inflicted on Anna, reflected a pattern that domestic violence experts have identified in the most dangerous cases. When domestic violence escalates to murder, it often involves extreme brutality that goes far beyond what would be necessary to cause death, suggesting that the perpetrator is acting out of rage rather than a desire to simply end the victim's life. The Ridgewood community was left reeling in the aftermath of the murders. Neighbors who had lived near the Cruz family for years struggled to understand how such violence could have occurred in their midst without anyone knowing that Anna and Annalise were in danger. The case raised difficult questions about the signs of domestic violence and whether there had been warning indicators that might have allowed intervention before the situation escalated to murder. In many domestic violence cases, there are patterns of escalating abuse that precede fatal violence, but these signs are not always visible to neighbors, friends, or even family members. Local domestic violence organizations use the tragedy as an opportunity to educate the community about the warning signs of abuse and the resources available to victims. They emphasize that domestic violence affects people of all backgrounds, ages, and socioeconomic levels, and that abusers often present a different face to the outside world than they do to their victims. The fact that the murders had occurred during a FaceTime call added a modern twist to an age-old problem, highlighting how technology can both connect families and traumatize them. The nephew who witnessed the murders would require significant psychological support to deal with the trauma he had experienced, and his case illustrated how domestic violence can affect entire extended families and social networks. Beyond the immediate victims, Anna and Annalise, the case created a circle of secondary victims who would be affected by the trauma for years to come. The nephew who witnessed the murders via FaceTime faced the challenge of processing what he had seen and dealing with any feelings of guilt or responsibility for not being able to prevent the violence. Extended family members, friends, neighbors, and first responders all experienced their own forms of trauma as a result of the case. The police officers who responded to the scene, the medical professionals who treated the victims, and the investigators who processed the crime scene were all exposed to the aftermath of extreme violence in ways that could affect their own mental health. The case also highlighted the psychological profile of perpetrators of domestic violence murder. While mental health issues are sometimes a factor in these cases, the majority of domestic violence perpetrators do not have diagnosable mental illnesses. Instead, their behavior is often driven by issues of control, power, and entitlement, the belief that they have the right to control their partners and children, even to the point of death. Cruz's silence in the aftermath of the murders was consistent with patterns observed in other domestic violence cases, where perpetrators sometimes withdraw into themselves after committing extreme acts of violence. This silence can make it difficult for investigators, prosecutors, and mental health professionals to understand the specific factors that led to the violence. The tragedy of Anna Pilotagsimapazita and Annalise Cruz serves as a stark reminder of the deadly potential of domestic violence and the importance of prevention and intervention efforts. While it's impossible to prevent every case of domestic violence from escalating to murder, there are strategies that communities can employ to reduce the risk. Early intervention programs that work with both victims and perpetrators can sometimes prevent violence from escalating. These programs focus on safety planning for victims while also working with abusers to help them understand the destructive nature of their behavior and develop healthier ways of managing conflict and emotion. Community education about the warning signs of domestic violence is crucial, as friends, family members, and neighbors are often in the best position to recognize when someone may be in danger. These warning signs can include isolation from friends and family, unexplained injuries, changes in behavior or personality, and expressions of fear about a partner's reactions. Technology, which played such a disturbing role in this case through the FaceTime witness, can also be a tool for prevention and intervention. Mobile apps that allow victims to quickly contact help, GPS tracking for restraining order violations, and other technological solutions are being developed to help protect victims of domestic violence. As the legal case against Ernesto Cruz moves through the courts, the community continues to grapple with the loss of Ana and Analyze. Memorial services and community gatherings have provided opportunities for neighbors and friends to come together to mourn and to support each other through the grieving process. The case has also prompted discussions about how to better protect victims of domestic violence and prevent similar tragedies in the future. Local organizations have increased their outreach efforts, working to ensure that potential victims know about the resources available to them and understand that help is available. For the extended family members and friends who knew Ana and Analyze, the healing process will be long and difficult. The sudden and violent nature of their deaths has left a trauma that will take years to process, particularly for the nephew who witnessed the murders and must live with those images for the rest of his life. The legal system will eventually render its judgment on Ernesto Cruz, determining his guilt or innocence and, if convicted, his punishment. But no legal outcome can restore the lives that were lost or undo the trauma that has been inflicted on so many people. As we conclude this story, it's important to remember that behind the statistics and legal proceedings are two real people whose lives were cut tragically short. Ana Pilatagsimapazita was a mother who loved her daughter and was working to build a life for her family in Queens. She had dreams and plans for the future, relationships that mattered to her, and a role as a mother that gave her life meaning and purpose. Analyze Cruz was a 2-year-old child full of potential and promise. She was at the age where every day brought new discoveries and new ways of understanding the world around her. She should have had decades ahead of her to grow, learn, explore, and contribute to the world in her own unique way. Their deaths remind us of the devastating impact of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing the warning signs and supporting those who may be in danger. They also remind us that behind every crime statistic are real people with real lives, real relationships, and real potential that has been forever lost. The tragedy that occurred on Forest Avenue in Ridgewood on July 19, 2025, will be remembered not just as a crime story, but as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when violence enters the home. Ana and Analyze deserve to live, to love, to grow, and to contribute to the world around them. Their memory serves as a call to all of us to work toward a world where such violence is no longer tolerated and where families can truly be safe in their own homes. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline provides 24/7 support at 1-800-799-7233, and local organizations throughout the country offer shelter, counseling, and other services to help victims escape dangerous situations. Tonight's story was difficult to tell and difficult to hear, but it's important that we bear witness to these tragedies and honor the memory of those whose lives were lost. Ana Pilatagsimapazita and Analyze Cruz will not be forgotten. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we delve into a case that reminds us how the golden years of life can sometimes harbor the darkest secrets. This is the story of Beverly Fletcher, whose life came to a tragic end in what should have been her sanctuary, a peaceful retirement community in Maryland. Picture Leisure World, nestled in the quiet suburbs of Silver Spring, Maryland. It's exactly what it sounds like, a haven designed for those 55 and older, a place where retirees come to enjoy their golden years in comfort and security. The community boasts well-maintained grounds, social activities, and the promise of peaceful living away from the chaos of the outside world. It was here, in this supposed sanctuary, that Beverly Fletcher and her husband Vivian Stewart Nation had chosen to spend their twilight years. At 80 years old, Vivian was a man who had lived through decades of change, witnessing the world transform around him. Beverly, his companion through the years, had settled into the rhythm of retirement life alongside him. Their apartment was like countless others in the complex, modest, comfortable, filled with the accumulated memories of a long life together. Photos on the walls, comfortable furniture worn smooth by years of use, the quiet hum of daily routines that mark the passage of time for couples who have been together for years. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful existence, something was brewing. Something that would shatter the tranquility of leisure world and leave investigators puzzling over how a place designed for peace could become the scene of such violence. The morning started like any other in the retirement community. Residents were beginning their daily routines, some heading to the community center for activities, others tending to small gardens or simply enjoying their morning coffee while watching the world wake up outside their windows. But inside apartment unit where Beverly and Vivian lived, tensions were rising. According to what investigators would later piece together, the couple had been having disagreements. These weren't the small spats that long-married couples often have about everyday matters. This was something deeper, more troubling. The argument centered around something that might seem mundane to outsiders: Vivian's doctor. It's not uncommon for elderly couples to have strong opinions about each other's medical care. After decades together, spouses often feel they know what's best for their partner, sometimes even more than the professionals treating them. But in this case, the disagreement escalated far beyond normal marital discord. As the morning progressed, the verbal argument between Beverly and Vivian intensified. Neighbors in adjacent apartments might have heard raised voices, but in a retirement community where residents often keep to themselves and respect each other's privacy, such sounds might not have immediately raised alarm bells. What started as words soon turned physical. The exact sequence of events may never be fully known, but what investigators would later discover painted a picture of a confrontation that spiraled completely out of control. In the confines of their apartment, surrounded by the accumulated possessions of their shared life, Beverly Fletcher's life came to an end at the hands of her husband. The details, as later revealed in charging documents, are difficult to comprehend. During the physical altercation, Beverly fell to the ground. It's a heartbreaking image, an elderly woman, vulnerable and at the mercy of someone she had trusted and shared her life with for years. But what happened next defies understanding. Vivian Nation, in a moment that would forever alter the course of both their lives, made a choice that cannot be undone. He took a hammer, a common household tool that in most homes sits quietly in a toolbox or drawer, waiting to hang a picture or repair a loose board. But in this moment, it became an instrument of unthinkable violence. According to the statements he would later give to investigators, Vivian pressed the hammer against Beverly's throat. The very idea sends chills down the spine. This was not a moment of brief rage or accidental harm. This was a deliberate act that continued long enough to end a life. The apartment that had been their shared home became a crime scene. The comfortable spaces where they had likely shared countless meals, watched television together, and lived out their retirement years were now marked by violence and loss. When authorities arrived at the Leisure World apartment, they found Beverly Fletcher deceased and Vivian Nation still present in the home. It's hard to imagine what those first responding officers encountered. The contrast between the peaceful retirement community setting and the violent scene before them must have been jarring. The investigation revealed physical evidence that corroborated the story Vivian would eventually tell. Police said they found a bloody hammer and screwdriver at the scene, silent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded. What strikes investigators in cases like these is often the ordinariness of the setting. This wasn't a crime that occurred in a dark alley or during a home invasion by strangers. This was domestic violence in its most tragic form, between two people who had chosen to spend their lives together, in a place designed for safety and peace. The evidence was clear enough that Vivian Stewart Nation was charged with first-degree murder. At 80 years old, he found himself facing the most serious charge possible under the law, for the death of the woman who had been his companion through the years. As we consider this case, it raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of relationships and how they can change over time. Domestic violence is often thought of as something that affects younger couples, but the reality is that it can occur at any stage of life. For elderly couples, the stresses can be unique. Health problems, financial concerns, the loss of independence, and the changing dynamics that come with aging can all create tension. Some couples grow closer through these challenges, while others find that old resentments surface or new pressures prove too much to bear. In retirement communities, residents often present their best faces to neighbors and staff. Behind closed doors, however, relationships can be strained by the same forces that affect couples of any age: control, frustration, and the feeling of being trapped by circumstances. The isolation that sometimes comes with age can make these situations even more dangerous. Unlike younger couples who might have children checking in regularly or workplace colleagues who might notice signs of trouble, elderly couples can become increasingly isolated, making it easier for abuse to go unnoticed. The murder of Beverly Fletcher sent shockwaves through the leisure world community. Residents who had chosen this place for its safety and tranquility were forced to confront the reality that danger can exist anywhere, even in their carefully planned sanctuary. For the staff and management of the retirement community, the incident posed difficult questions about security and the extent to which they could monitor or intervene in the private lives of their residents. How do you balance respect for privacy with the need to ensure safety? How do you identify warning signs when couples have learned to hide their problems behind decades of practiced discretion? The case also highlighted the broader issue of domestic violence among the elderly, a problem that often goes unrecognized and unreported. Family members, healthcare providers, and community workers all play roles in identifying and addressing abuse among older adults, but the signs can be subtle and easy to miss. With Vivian Nation charged with first-degree murder, the legal system began the process of seeking justice for Beverly Fletcher. At 80 years old, facing such serious charges represents a unique situation for both the defendant and the court system. The evidence in the case appeared straightforward: physical evidence at the scene, the defendant's own statements to investigators, and the clear cause of death. But cases involving elderly defendants often raise questions about mental competency, health issues, and whether someone of advanced age should face the same penalties as a younger person. The legal proceedings would need to balance the severity of the crime against the reality of dealing with an octogenarian defendant. Questions of whether Vivian was mentally competent to stand trial, whether health issues played a role in his actions, and how the justice system should handle such cases all come into play. As we consider Beverly Fletcher's story, it's important to remember that behind the crime statistics and legal proceedings was a real person whose life was cut short. Beverly had lived through decades of change in American society, had likely experienced joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges that shaped who she was. She had made the decision to spend her final years in what was supposed to be a peaceful retirement community, surrounded by others in similar situations. She should have been able to enjoy whatever time remained to her, perhaps reading books she'd always meant to get to, pursuing hobbies, or simply enjoying the quieter pace of retirement life. Instead, her story became another statistic in the tragic catalogue of domestic violence. Her death serves as a reminder that abuse and violence can occur at any age, in any setting, and between people who once cared for each other deeply. The case also reminds us to be aware of the elderly people in our communities. A friendly check-in, an offer of help, or simply being present in someone's life can sometimes make the difference between isolation and connection, between despair and hope. In the aftermath of Beverly Fletcher's murder, the leisure world community was forced to grapple with questions they had never expected to face. How do you process such violence in a place designed for peace? How do you help residents feel safe again after such a shocking event? Retirement communities often become like small towns, where residents develop relationships with neighbors and staff members become familiar faces. The violation of that sense of security can be particularly traumatic for elderly residents who may already feel vulnerable due to age-related physical limitations. Community leaders likely had to balance being transparent about what had happened with protecting the privacy and dignity of residents. They had to address safety concerns while maintaining the atmosphere of independence and freedom that makes such communities attractive to retirees. The incident probably led to discussions about warning signs, resources for residents experiencing domestic difficulties, and the delicate balance between respecting privacy and ensuring safety. These are complex issues with no easy answers. Beverly Fletcher's death highlights the importance of recognizing that domestic violence doesn't disappear with age. If anything, the isolation and physical vulnerability that can come with advancing years may make elderly victims even more at risk. Healthcare providers, family members, and community workers all need to be aware of the signs of abuse among older adults. These might include unexplained injuries, changes in behavior, social withdrawal, or signs of fear around a partner or caregiver. For elderly individuals experiencing abuse, seeking help can be particularly challenging. They may feel ashamed, may worry about being placed in institutional care, or may feel that their options are limited due to their age or physical condition. Creating awareness about resources and support systems specifically designed for older adults is crucial. Prevention efforts might include education about healthy relationships that continues throughout life, support services for couples dealing with the stresses of aging, and training for staff in retirement communities and healthcare settings to recognize warning signs of abuse. As the legal process continues, investigators and prosecutors work to build their case while defense attorneys prepare their response. The complexity of cases involving elderly defendants means that mental health evaluations, medical assessments, and determinations of competency all become part of the proceedings. For Vivian Nation, facing first-degree murder charges at age 80 represents the potential end of his life in prison. The irony is stark. A man who should have been spending his final years in peaceful retirement instead faces the possibility of dying behind bars for taking the life of his companion. The case will likely raise questions about motive that may never be fully answered. What drove a man to such extreme violence against someone he had presumably loved and lived with for years? Was this the culmination of long-simmering resentments, the result of mental health issues, or simply a tragic moment when anger overwhelmed reason? Leisure World will continue to operate, its residents will continue their daily routines, and life will go on. But the memory of what happened in that apartment will linger. Some residents may look at their neighbors differently, wondering what private struggles might be hidden behind closed doors. The tragedy serves as a stark reminder that the challenges of human relationships don't disappear with age. The pressures that can lead to violence, control, frustration, feeling trapped, financial stress, health concerns, these can actually intensify in later life rather than diminish. For other retirement communities, Beverly Fletcher's death became a case study in the importance of being prepared for situations they hope will never occur. How do you train staff to recognize warning signs? How do you create systems that protect privacy while ensuring safety? How do you help a community heal after such trauma? As this case moves through the legal system and eventually fades from the headlines, it's important that Beverly Fletcher not become just another crime statistic. She was a person who lived a full life before it was tragically cut short. She had experiences, relationships, dreams, and hopes that extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. In telling her story, we honor not just her memory but also shine a light on an issue that affects thousands of elderly Americans every year. Domestic violence among older adults is often a hidden problem, overlooked by family members, healthcare providers, and society at large. Beverly's story reminds us to be more aware, more compassionate, and more willing to intervene when we see signs that someone might be in danger. It reminds us that abuse can happen to anyone, at any age, and that the people around us may be struggling with situations we can't imagine. The impact of Beverly Fletcher's murder extends far beyond the retirement community where it occurred. Her death affects family members who must grapple with the dual trauma of losing a loved one and having another family member charged with the crime. It affects the other residents of Leisure World who must reconcile their sense of safety with this new reality. It affects the broader community as people confront the uncomfortable truth that violence can intrude even into spaces designed for peace and security. For those working in elder care, law enforcement, and domestic violence prevention, cases like Beverly's highlight the need for specialized training and resources. Recognizing abuse among older adults requires understanding the unique dynamics that affect elderly couples, the signs that might indicate problems, and the barriers that prevent victims from seeking help. The case also raises questions about how society views and treats elderly individuals. Are older adults taken seriously when they report abuse? Do we assume that domestic violence is less severe or less important when it involves elderly couples? Do we provide adequate resources and support for older victims of abuse? As the legal proceedings in Vivian Nation's case continue, Beverly Fletcher's death will hopefully serve as a catalyst for important conversations about domestic violence among the elderly. Her story, tragic though it is, can help raise awareness about a problem that too often remains hidden in the shadows. For retirement communities across the country, the case provides an opportunity to review policies, train staff, and create resources that might help prevent similar tragedies. For families with elderly relatives, it's a reminder to stay connected and aware of the dynamics in their loved ones' relationships. For all of us, Beverly Fletcher's story is a reminder that compassion, awareness, and intervention can sometimes make the difference between life and death. It's a call to be more attentive to the elderly people in our communities and to recognize that age doesn't provide immunity from the darker aspects of human nature. The murder of Beverly Fletcher in a quiet retirement community in Maryland represents more than just another tragic crime. It's a window into the complex world of relationships in later life, the hidden problem of elder abuse, and the ways that violence can intrude into even the most protected spaces. As we close this story, we remember Beverly not just as a victim, but as a person who lived a full life before it was tragically cut short. Her death reminds us of the importance of staying connected to the elderly people in our lives, of being aware of the signs of abuse, and of speaking up when we see something that concerns us. The case also serves as a reminder that the justice system must be prepared to handle complex situations involving elderly defendants, balancing the need for accountability with the realities of aging and the unique circumstances that can affect older adults. Most importantly, Beverly Fletcher's story is a call to action. It challenges us to do better at protecting vulnerable elderly individuals, at recognizing and addressing domestic violence at all stages of life, and at creating communities where everyone can live safely and with dignity, regardless of their age. In retirement communities across the country, residents continue to pursue their daily routines, hoping for peaceful and fulfilling final chapters to their lives. Beverly Fletcher's death reminds us that this hope should be a reality for everyone, and that we all have a role to play in making it so. Her story, though it ended in tragedy, can serve as a catalyst for change, awareness, and prevention. In that way, Beverly Fletcher's life and death can have meaning beyond the immediate circumstances of the crime, contributing to a safer and more compassionate world for elderly individuals everywhere. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet borough of Slatington, Pennsylvania, nestled in the rolling hills of Lehigh County about 15 miles north of Allentown, life moved at the unhurried pace that characterizes small-town America. Tree-lined streets wound past modest homes where neighbors knew each other's names, where the biggest excitement might be the Friday night high school football game or the annual summer festival. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted in the fundamental decency of their fellow human beings. But on a spring evening in May 2024, that sense of security would be shattered forever. David Hittinger was 37 years old, a man who had experienced his share of life's ups and downs but maintained an optimistic spirit that drew people to him. Friends described him as someone who could light up a room with his infectious laugh, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and checked in when you were going through tough times. He had that rare quality of making everyone feel like they mattered, like they were worth his time and attention. David had recently found himself in need of a place to stay. Life had dealt him some difficult cards, as it does to many of us, and he was working to get back on his feet. When Joshua Moser, a 33-year-old resident of West Franklin Street in Slatington, offered him a room in his house, it seemed like a blessing. Here was a chance for David to regroup, to have a stable roof over his head while he figured out his next steps. Joshua Moser was, by most accounts, an unremarkable man living an unremarkable life in this unremarkable town. He kept to himself mostly, the kind of neighbor you might nod to when taking out the trash but never really get to know. His house on West Franklin Street was typical of the area, older construction, probably built in the post-war boom, with a basement that served as storage and perhaps a workshop space. From the outside, it looked like any other home in the neighborhood, giving no hint of the darkness that would soon unfold within its walls. The arrangement between David and Joshua seemed straightforward enough. David would stay at the house, presumably paying some rent or helping with expenses, while he worked to stabilize his situation. For a few weeks, this living arrangement appeared to function normally. Neighbors didn't notice any unusual disturbances, no signs of conflict or tension that might have warned of what was to come. But beneath the surface of this seemingly mundane domestic arrangement, something was brewing. What exactly triggered the violence that would follow remains unclear. Investigators would later describe it as some sort of disagreement, but the specific nature of that disagreement has never been fully explained. Was it about money? Personal boundaries? Something David said or did? Or was it something much darker, something that had been building in Joshua's mind for reasons that only he could understand? Saturday, May 11, 2024, started like any other spring day in Slatington. The weather was pleasant, the kind of day that makes you want to open your windows and let the fresh air flow through your house. David went about his normal routine, likely unaware that this would be his last day alive. He spoke with friends, made plans, lived his life with the assumption that tomorrow would come as it always had. But somewhere in Joshua Moser's house on West Franklin Street, something went terribly wrong. According to what Joshua would later confess to police, the confrontation began in the basement of the house. Perhaps it started as an argument, voices raised in the confined space below ground level where concrete walls would muffle any sounds from reaching the neighbors. Maybe it escalated gradually, or maybe it exploded into violence with shocking suddenness. We may never know exactly how those final moments unfolded. What we do know, from Joshua's own admission to investigators, is that he strangled David Hittinger. The act of strangulation is particularly personal and prolonged. It's not the instantaneous violence of a gunshot or even a single blow. It requires sustained physical effort, time for both the perpetrator and victim to understand exactly what is happening. It's an intimate form of murder that speaks to something deeply disturbed in the mind of the killer. But Joshua didn't stop there. Even as David lay dying or dead, Joshua retrieved a hammer and struck him in the head. Whether this was to ensure death or was part of some rage-fueled continuation of the attack, we cannot know. What we can say is that by the time Joshua's violence was spent, David Hittinger, the man with the infectious laugh who remembered birthdays and cared about people, was dead in that basement. Most people, faced with such a horrific situation, would immediately contact authorities. They might claim self-defense, or accident, or temporary insanity, but they would call for help. Joshua Moser did not. Instead, he made a decision that would transform this case from a tragic homicide into something far more disturbing. Joshua decided to dismember David's body. The logistics of what Joshua did next are both practically complex and psychologically devastating to contemplate. Dismemberment requires planning, tools, and a stomach for the most grisly work imaginable. It means making deliberate choices about how to dispose of another human being's remains. It means spending hours engaged in an activity that would traumatize most people beyond recovery. Joshua carried out this grisly task methodically. He cut David's body into pieces, cleaning up the basement afterward to remove evidence of what had transpired. Then he made another calculated decision. Rather than disposing of all the remains in one location, he would scatter them across multiple sites, perhaps believing this would make discovery less likely or identification more difficult. The first location Joshua chose was a wooded area along a hiking trail in Washington Township, a rural part of Lehigh County where the dense forest provided cover for his dark work. He likely drove there under cover of darkness, carrying his macabre cargo into the woods where hikers and nature lovers would normally seek peace and renewal. The irony is stark. These beautiful natural spaces, meant for reflection and escape from life's troubles, became repositories for the evidence of life's destruction. The second location was another wooded area, again chosen for its isolation and the cover provided by the trees. Joshua was clearly thinking strategically about disposal, selecting locations that were remote enough to avoid immediate discovery but accessible enough for him to reach by vehicle. The third and perhaps most disturbing location was Fairview Cemetery in Slatington itself. Cemeteries are sacred spaces, places where we honor our dead and provide comfort to the grieving. For Joshua to choose such a location for disposing of evidence shows a profound disrespect not just for David, but for the very concept of human dignity in death. The families visiting loved ones buried in that cemetery would have no idea they were walking past evidence of murder. But while Joshua may have thought he had covered his tracks, David Hittinger was not a man who simply disappeared from people's lives without notice. He had friends who cared about him, people who expected to hear from him regularly. When those friends didn't hear from David, they began to worry. Monday, May 13th, ironically, David's 37th birthday, one of his concerned friends contacted Pennsylvania State Police to report him missing. The timing is heartbreaking. David should have been celebrating another year of life, perhaps surrounded by friends sharing cake and stories. Instead, he had been dead for 2 days, his remains scattered across Lehigh County while his loved ones wondered where he was. The missing person report was filed at 1:30 in the afternoon. The friend explained to officers that they hadn't heard from David since Saturday evening around 7 p.m., roughly around the time that Joshua would later admit to killing him. For someone in David's situation, living day to day and working to rebuild his life, maintaining contact with friends would have been especially important. These were his support network, his connection to stability and hope for the future. State police began their investigation immediately. In missing person cases, the first 48 hours are crucial, not just because the trail of evidence remains fresh, but because the chances of finding someone alive decrease dramatically with each passing hour. The officers had no way of knowing that they were already too late, that David had been dead since Saturday night. The investigation led police quickly to Joshua Moser's house on West Franklin Street, where David had been staying. This made sense. When someone goes missing, you start with their last known address and work outward from there. Officers likely knocked on the door of the modest home, perhaps expecting to find either David himself or some simple explanation for his absence. Instead, they found Joshua Moser, who would soon become the prime suspect in David's disappearance and death. The details of exactly how the investigation unfolded remain somewhat unclear, but we know that by Thursday, May 16th, police were searching wooded areas in Washington Township. This suggests that either they had developed information pointing them toward those locations, or they had already begun to suspect foul play and were conducting systematic searches of areas where someone might dispose of evidence. The search teams combed through the forests methodically, officers and investigators walking carefully through underbrush and around trees, looking for anything that seemed out of place. It's grim work, searching for human remains, requiring both professional detachment and deep empathy for the victim and their loved ones. Their search was successful, though success in such a context feels like entirely the wrong word. They found parts of David Hittinger's dismembered body in the wooded areas of Washington Township, confirming the worst fears of his friends and family. The discovery transformed the missing person case into a homicide investigation. But the investigation was far from over. The scattered remains suggested that there might be additional locations to search, and investigators had to piece together not just what had happened to David, but who was responsible for his death and dismemberment. Meanwhile, Joshua Moser had left the area. Whether he fled immediately after the murder or only after he realized police were investigating David's disappearance, we don't know. What we do know is that he ended up in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, about an hour's drive from Slatington. Monroe County is home to the Pocono Mountains, a popular tourist destination known for its natural beauty and recreational opportunities. It's also relevant to this case, where Joshua had existing legal troubles. He was on parole there following a conviction for a fatal DUI crash in 2016, a conviction that suggests this was not his first encounter with serious criminal behavior. Police located Joshua in Monroe County and arrested him on a parole violation. This was likely a strategic decision by investigators. By holding him on the parole violation, they could keep him in custody while they continued to investigate the homicide and gather evidence. It also meant they could question him about David's disappearance without having to worry about him fleeing further. The questioning of Joshua Moser took place on May 15 at 5:18 p.m., according to police records. He was interviewed by Pennsylvania State Police from the Stroudsburg Barracks, experienced investigators who would have approached this interview with careful strategy. They knew they potentially had a killer in custody, but they needed him to talk, to provide the details that would allow them to build a prosecutable case. What happened in that interview room would provide the key to understanding not just how David died, but the full extent of Joshua's horrific actions afterward. Faced with mounting evidence and perhaps realizing that continued denials were futile, Joshua Moser confessed. But his confession revealed details that were even more disturbing than investigators might have expected. Joshua admitted that he had strangled David Hittinger in the basement of his Franklin Street home. He confessed to striking David in the head with a hammer. These admissions alone would have constituted a murder charge, but Joshua's confession continued. He told investigators that after killing David, he had dismembered the body. He described how he had scattered the remains across 3 different locations: the wooded areas in Washington Township where police had already found evidence, and Fairview Cemetery in Slatington. The confession provided investigators with the roadmap they needed to complete their evidence gathering. They now knew where to look for additional remains, and they had Joshua's own words describing his actions. It was a prosecutor's dream in terms of building a solid case, but it was also a nightmare in terms of the human tragedy it represented. Armed with Joshua's confession, investigators returned to their searches. They found additional evidence at Fairview Cemetery, that sacred space where Joshua had chosen to dispose of parts of David's body. The discovery in the cemetery was particularly disturbing to the local community. Cemeteries are places of peace and reverence, not crime scenes. The investigation revealed the full scope of Joshua's actions over those few days in May. After killing David on Saturday night, he had spent Sunday and Monday disposing of the remains, carefully selecting multiple locations to scatter the evidence. It was a methodical, calculated approach to covering up his crime, not the panicked actions of someone who had killed in the heat of passion, but the deliberate behavior of someone thinking strategically about avoiding detection. On Friday, May 17, 2024, Joshua Moser was formally charged with criminal homicide, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. The charges reflected not just the murder itself, but the horrific actions Joshua had taken afterward. In many jurisdictions, the desecration of human remains carries severe penalties on its own, recognizing that such behavior violates fundamental human dignity even beyond the original crime. The news of Joshua's arrest and the charges against him sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Slatington. This was not the kind of crime that people in small towns expect to confront. Slatington is a place where the most serious crimes are usually property theft or drunk driving, not premeditated murder and dismemberment. Local residents struggled to process what had happened in their midst. The house on West Franklin Street where David had died became a grim landmark, a reminder that evil could exist anywhere, even in the most ordinary-seeming places. Neighbors who had lived near Joshua for years suddenly questioned whether they had ever really known him at all. The case proceeded through the court system with Joshua held without bail, standard procedure for first-degree murder charges, especially when the evidence is as overwhelming as his own confession combined with physical evidence. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for July 26, 2024, where a judge would review the evidence and determine whether there was sufficient cause to proceed with the prosecution. But the story would take another dark turn before the case could reach trial. On a Saturday in early 2025, corrections officers at Lehigh County Jail made a grim discovery during their routine checks. Joshua Moser was found dead in his cell. The man who had confessed to brutally murdering and dismembering David Hittinger would never face a jury for his crimes. The discovery of Joshua's death raised many questions. Was it suicide? Did he take his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions? Or was it natural causes, a medical emergency, or some other circumstance? The exact cause of Joshua's death has not been publicly disclosed, leaving another mystery in a case that had already provided too many dark revelations. For David Hittinger's friends and family, Joshua's death represented a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, there was perhaps some relief that they would not have to endure a lengthy trial, would not have to hear the graphic details of David's final moments repeated in open court. They would not have to face the possibility of Joshua receiving anything less than the maximum sentence, or of appeals dragging the case out for years. On the other hand, Joshua's death meant that many questions would remain forever unanswered. What exactly had triggered his violence against David? Was there a history of mental illness or previous violent behavior that might have warned of this tragedy? Had there been signs that friends, family, or authorities could have recognized and acted upon? Most importantly, Joshua's death meant that there would never be a full accounting of his actions, never a moment in court where he would have to face David's family and friends and explain why he had taken the life of someone who had trusted him enough to accept shelter in his home. The case of David Hittinger's murder highlights several disturbing realities about violent crime in America. First, it demonstrates how quickly a routine living arrangement can turn deadly when mental illness, substance abuse, or simple human evil enters the equation. David thought he was accepting help from someone who would provide him with temporary housing while he got back on his feet. Instead, he found himself living with someone capable of unspeakable violence. Second, the case shows how even small communities are not immune from the most serious crimes. Slatington is exactly the kind of place where people move to escape urban crime, where they expect their children to be safe and their neighbors to be trustworthy. The murder of David Hittinger shattered those assumptions and reminded residents that danger can lurk anywhere, even behind the most ordinary facades. Third, Joshua's actions after the murder, the careful dismemberment and disposal of remains across multiple locations, suggest a level of calculation and premeditation that goes beyond a crime of passion. This was not someone who killed in a moment of rage and then immediately regretted their actions. This was someone who spent days methodically covering up evidence, showing a consciousness of guilt and a willingness to desecrate human remains that speaks to a particularly disturbing psychology. The geographical scope of Joshua's disposal efforts also demonstrates how modern criminals can use mobility to complicate investigations. By scattering David's remains across multiple jurisdictions and location types, wooded areas in Washington Township and a cemetery in Slatington, Joshua may have hoped to delay discovery or make identification more difficult. In an earlier era, before modern forensic techniques and interagency cooperation, such a strategy might have been more successful. For the investigators who worked this case, the rapid resolution represented both professional success and personal trauma. They had quickly identified the perpetrator, obtained a confession, and gathered the physical evidence needed for prosecution. From a law enforcement perspective, this was excellent police work that brought swift justice for David's murder. But the investigators also had to confront the darkest aspects of human behavior. They had to search through forests for dismembered remains. They had to process crime scenes that would haunt their dreams. They had to listen to Joshua's confession and try to understand how one human being could do such things to another. The psychological toll of such work is immense, and it's a cost that society rarely acknowledges when celebrating successful criminal investigations. The community of Slatington, meanwhile, had to grapple with the knowledge that such evil had existed in their midst. The house on West Franklin Street where David died became a constant reminder of the tragedy. The hiking trails in Washington Township where his remains were found would forever be associated with this crime for those who knew the details. Even Fairview Cemetery, that place of peace and remembrance, had been contaminated by Joshua's actions. In the months following Joshua's arrest and subsequent death, the people of Slatington slowly began to process what had happened and what it meant for their community. There were discussions about safety, about whether there had been warning signs that could have been recognized, about how to prevent such tragedies in the future. Some residents questioned whether they had been too trusting, too willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Others argued that the solution was not to become suspicious and paranoid, but to build stronger community connections that might identify and help troubled individuals before they turned violent. The tragedy also sparked conversations about mental health resources, substance abuse treatment, and the challenges faced by people experiencing housing instability, the circumstances that had led David to accept Joshua's offer of a place to stay in the first place. If David had had more options, more support systems, would he still be alive today? These are the kinds of questions that communities must ask themselves after such tragedies, even though the answers are often unclear and the solutions complex. It's easier to focus on the criminal justice aspects of the case, the arrest, the charges, the confession, than to grapple with the deeper social issues that may have contributed to the tragedy. For David Hittinger's friends and family, the pain of loss was compounded by the horrific circumstances of his death. Grieving the loss of a loved one is always difficult, but when that loss involves murder and dismemberment, the trauma is magnified exponentially. They not only had to cope with David's death, but with the knowledge of what he had suffered in his final moments and what had been done to his body afterward. The fact that David was killed on or near his birthday added another layer of tragedy to the case. May 13th should have been a day of celebration, a day when friends gathered to wish David well and mark another year of his life. Instead, it became the day his friends realized he was missing, the day that set in motion the investigation that would reveal the full extent of the horror that had befallen him. In the broader context of true crime, the murder of David Hittinger represents a particularly disturbing category of offense, the betrayal killing, where the perpetrator is someone the victim trusted. David had accepted Joshua's offer of housing, had moved into his home, had likely shared meals and conversations with the man who would eventually kill him. This violation of trust makes the crime even more heinous than random violence between strangers. The dismemberment aspect of the case also places it in a small but particularly disturbing subset of criminal behavior. Most murders, even premeditated ones, do not involve post-mortem dismemberment. Such actions require a level of detachment from normal human empathy that suggests severe psychological disturbance. It's the kind of behavior associated with serial killers and the most extreme criminal personalities. Joshua's confession to the crime raises questions about his mental state and motivations. Why did he confess? Was it genuine remorse, or simply a recognition that the evidence against him was overwhelming? Did he hope that cooperation might result in a more lenient sentence, or was he experiencing some form of psychological breakdown that compelled him to reveal the truth? The timing of his confession, coming after his arrest on a parole violation but before formal charges were filed in David's murder, suggests that he may have been advised by legal counsel or investigators that cooperation was in his best interest. Alternatively, the weight of what he had done may have become unbearable, leading him to seek some form of relief through confession. Whatever his motivations, Joshua's confession provided investigators with crucial details that allowed them to recover David's remains and understand the full scope of the crime. Without that confession, parts of David's body might never have been found, leaving his family without closure and potentially allowing Joshua to escape full accountability for his actions. The fact that Joshua had a previous conviction for a fatal DUI crash in 2016 raises questions about whether this tragedy could have been prevented. Should someone with such a serious criminal history have been subject to more intensive supervision? Were there warning signs in his behavior that parole officers or other authorities should have recognized? These questions are particularly relevant given that Joshua was living independently and able to offer housing to David. If he was on parole, were there restrictions on his living arrangements or requirements for regular check-ins that might have provided opportunities for intervention? The 2016 DUI conviction also suggests a pattern of behavior involving violence and disregard for human life. While drunk driving and premeditated murder are very different crimes, they both involve choices that put others at risk. A person who has already caused one death through reckless behavior might be considered at higher risk for future violence. As the case faded from immediate public attention, replaced by other news and other tragedies, the people most affected by David Hittinger's murder continued to live with its consequences. His friends carried the memory of his infectious laugh and caring nature, but also the trauma of learning how his life had ended. His family faced the double burden of grief and horror, knowing that someone they loved had died in such terrible circumstances. The investigators who worked the case moved on to other assignments, but the images and details from those few weeks in May 2024 would likely stay with them throughout their careers. The discovery of human remains in peaceful forest settings, the methodical documentation of evidence in multiple locations, the interview room confession that revealed the full extent of human depravity, these are the kinds of experiences that change people, that remind them daily of the darkness that can exist in the human heart. The residents of Slatington gradually returned to their normal routines, but with a heightened awareness of their vulnerability. The quiet streets and friendly neighbors were still there, but the illusion of complete safety had been shattered. Parents might watch their children more closely, residents might be more careful about locking their doors, and everyone would remember that evil can hide behind the most ordinary appearances. For the broader true crime community, the case of David Hittinger represents another data point in the ongoing effort to understand what drives people to commit such terrible acts. Criminologists and psychologists study cases like this one, looking for patterns and warning signs that might help prevent future tragedies. Law enforcement professionals analyze the investigative techniques that led to the quick resolution, seeking lessons that can be applied to other cases. But beyond the academic and professional interest, cases like this one serve as stark reminders of our shared humanity and vulnerability. David Hittinger was not a celebrity or public figure whose death would generate international headlines. He was an ordinary person living an ordinary life, someone who could have been any of us or any of our loved ones. His murder reminds us that tragedy can strike anywhere, that trust can be betrayed, and that the most mundane decisions, like accepting an offer of temporary housing, can have life or death consequences. The story of David Hittinger's murder is ultimately a story about the fragility of human life and the preciousness of human dignity. It's about how quickly normalcy can turn to nightmare, how trust can be weaponized by those with evil intentions, and how the actions of one disturbed individual can ripple outward to traumatize an entire community. As we reflect on this tragedy, we're reminded to cherish the relationships we have, to look out for the vulnerable people in our communities, and to never take for granted the basic assumption of safety that allows us to go about our daily lives. David Hittinger deserved better than the fate that befell him, deserved to celebrate his 37th birthday surrounded by friends, deserved the chance to rebuild his life and find happiness. Instead, he became the victim of a crime so brutal and senseless that it challenges our understanding of human nature itself. His story serves as both a memorial to his life and a warning about the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. In remembering David and the circumstances of his death, we honor his memory while acknowledging the reality that such tragedies, while rare, are always possible in a world where free will allows for both great kindness and terrible evil. The house on West Franklin Street in Slatington still stands, though it will forever be marked by the tragedy that occurred within its walls. The hiking trails in Washington Township continue to attract nature lovers, though some who know the case may find it difficult to walk those paths without thinking of what was discovered there. Fairview Cemetery remains a place of peace and remembrance, though it too bears the invisible scars of its connection to this crime. And somewhere, the friends and family of David Hittinger continue to carry his memory, working to focus on the joy he brought to their lives rather than the horror of his death. They remember his laugh, his kindness, his ability to make others feel valued and important. In their memories, David Hittinger lives on not as a victim of a brutal crime, but as a beloved friend and family member whose life, though cut tragically short, had meaning and value that no act of violence can diminish. This is how we must remember David Hittinger, not just as the victim in a true crime story, but as a human being who lived and loved and mattered to the people around him. His death was a tragedy that should never have happened, but his life was a gift that should never be forgotten. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world settles into stillness, we remember that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life mattered, whose loss created ripples of grief that continue long after the headlines fade. David Hittinger was such a person, remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived, and for the light he brought to the world during his time with us. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Sometimes the most terrifying crimes happen not in dark alleyways or abandoned buildings, but within the walls we call home. Tonight, we delve into a case that shook San Antonio, Texas, in the summer of 2025, a story that reveals how jealousy and rage can transform a marriage into something unrecognizable, and how one man's actions would haunt an entire community. This is the story of Angela Bird, a 44-year-old woman whose life was cut short in the most unimaginable way, and her husband Charles, whose confession would chill investigators to their core. The oppressive Texas heat of July 2025 hung heavy in the air on Saturday, July 19, when Behar County Sheriff's deputies received a call that would lead them to one of the most disturbing crime scenes they'd ever encountered. The call came from someone close to the family, Charles Bird's own son, reporting something that seemed almost impossible to believe. His father, he said, had confessed to killing his stepmother, Angela. The address led deputies to a rural area in far south Behar County, along Pleasanton Road, a stretch of land where mobile homes dotted the landscape, and neighbors were spread far enough apart that screams might go unheard. The home itself was unremarkable from the outside, a typical mobile home that blended into the rural Texas setting. But what waited inside would haunt everyone who entered. As deputies approached the residence in the 22100 block of Pleasanton Road, they had no idea they were about to uncover a month-long nightmare that had been playing out behind closed doors. The summer heat had been particularly brutal that year, with temperatures soaring well above normal, making what they would soon discover even more horrific. When law enforcement entered the mobile home, the smell hit them immediately, a putrid, overwhelming odor that could only mean one thing. Death had been living in this house for quite some time. Following the stench, they made their way through the cramped quarters of the mobile home, past furniture and personal belongings that spoke of a life that had once been lived here. In one of the back rooms, wrapped in plastic sheeting and pieces of carpet, they found Angela Bird. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, telling a story of weeks of concealment. The temperature inside the mobile home, amplified by the Texas summer heat and lack of proper ventilation, had accelerated the decomposition process. The scene was so disturbing that even seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the worst they'd encountered in their careers. But Charles Bird was nowhere to be found. As deputies processed the scene and began their investigation, they realized they were now dealing with a manhunt for a man who had apparently been living with his wife's corpse for over a month. Charles Vandoyle Bird was 49 years old at the time of his arrest, a man who, to outside observers, might have seemed ordinary. But as investigators would soon learn, beneath the surface lay a volatile combination of jealousy, control, and rage that would ultimately prove deadly. Sheriff Javier Salazar, who would become the face of this investigation for the media, described Charles as someone who had reached what he called a mental break. But this wasn't a sudden snap. It was the culmination of mounting tensions that had been building in the Bird household for some time. Those who knew the couple described a relationship that had been troubled, marked by Charles's increasing paranoia and jealousy. Angela, at 44, was described by those who knew her as someone trying to navigate a difficult marriage. The dynamics between Charles and Angela had grown increasingly strained, with Charles becoming more controlling and suspicious of his wife's activities and relationships. The rural setting of their home provided Charles with a sense of isolation that he seemed to prefer. Far from the prying eyes of close neighbors, he could control Angela's comings and goings, monitor her interactions, and feed his growing paranoia about her fidelity. This isolation would later prove crucial in understanding how he was able to conceal his crime for so long. Charles had a history that suggested he was capable of violence, though the full extent of any previous incidents may never be fully known. What investigators did know was that he possessed a temperament that could turn explosive when he felt his control was threatened. And on June 16, 2025, that explosive temperament would have deadly consequences. To understand what happened on that summer night in June, we have to reconstruct the events based on Charles Bird's own confession, a confession so chilling that investigators would later describe it as one of the most disturbing they'd ever heard. June 16 had started like many other days in the Bird household, but beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. Charles had become increasingly convinced that Angela was having an affair. Whether this suspicion was based on real evidence or was simply the product of his growing paranoia, we may never know. What we do know is that in Charles's mind, his worst fears were about to be confirmed. According to Charles's later confession to investigators, the evening of June 16 began with what he perceived as the ultimate betrayal. He claimed that Angela was expecting another man to visit their home, a claim that sent him into a rage that would prove unstoppable. In his recorded interview with investigators, Charles described how his jealousy consumed him that night, how every suspicion he'd harbored about his wife seemed to crystallize into what he saw as undeniable proof of her infidelity. The argument that ensued was not the first between the couple, but it would tragically be their last. Charles later told investigators that during this confrontation, something inside him snapped. The jealousy, the rage, the feeling of betrayal, it all coalesced into a moment of violence that would change everything. In his confession, Charles admitted to strangling Angela during the argument. He described how he put his hands around her neck and squeezed, watching as the life drained from her eyes. He told investigators that he watched her die, a detail that would particularly disturb law enforcement officers who heard his confession. There was a coldness to his recounting of events, a detachment that suggested he had somehow separated himself from the reality of what he had done. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Charles's confession was what came next. After Angela was dead, after he had taken the life of the woman he had promised to love and cherish, Charles faced a choice. He could call for help, he could report what had happened, he could face the consequences of his actions. Instead, he made a decision that would compound his crime in the most horrific way possible. Fearing the consequences of his actions, Charles decided to conceal Angela's death. But this wasn't a panicked, temporary measure. What Charles did next would demonstrate a level of callousness that defied comprehension. After killing Angela on June 16, Charles Bird made a decision that would turn their mobile home into a house of horrors. Rather than report her death or seek help, he chose to hide the evidence of his crime, and that evidence was his wife's body. Using plastic sheeting and pieces of carpet, Charles wrapped Angela's remains and concealed them within their home. The summer heat of Texas, which regularly soared into the triple digits, began its work on the body immediately. The mobile home, with its limited ventilation and poor insulation, became like an oven, accelerating the decomposition process. And Charles continued to live there. For 32 days, he carried on as if nothing had happened, sleeping, eating, and going about his daily routine while his wife's body decomposed in the same structure. The smell would have been overwhelming, yet somehow Charles managed to endure it, or perhaps he had simply become numb to it. During this month-long period, Charles had to interact with the outside world. He had to maintain some semblance of normalcy to avoid suspicion. Friends, family members, and acquaintances who might ask about Angela had to be dealt with. Charles created stories, made excuses, and deflected questions about his wife's whereabouts. When people asked where Angela was, Charles had ready answers. She was visiting family, she was away on business, she needed some time to herself, lies that bought him time but couldn't last forever. Some close to the family began to grow suspicious as weeks passed without any sign of Angela. Her absence became more noticeable, more difficult to explain away. The psychological toll of living with such a horrific secret must have been immense, yet Charles managed to maintain his deception for over a month. He shopped for groceries, he interacted with neighbors when necessary, he carried on the mundane tasks of daily life while concealing one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. But secrets this dark have a way of consuming those who keep them, and Charles's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. The stress of maintaining his lies, combined with the reality of what he had done, was taking its toll. His behavior began to change in ways that those close to him couldn't ignore. As July progressed, Charles Bird's ability to maintain his deception began to deteriorate. The psychological pressure of living with such a massive lie, combined with the physical reality of his living situation, was becoming unbearable. The walls he had built around his secret were beginning to crumble. It was Charles's own son who would ultimately bring this nightmare to light. The young man had grown increasingly concerned about his stepmother's prolonged absence. Angela's disappearance had gone on too long, and the explanations he was getting from his father were no longer satisfactory. Something was wrong, and he knew it. The exact circumstances of how Charles finally revealed the truth to his son remain private, but what we know is that Charles eventually broke down and confessed to the unthinkable. In a moment that must have been devastating for the young man, Charles admitted that he had killed Angela. The son, faced with this horrific revelation, did what he had to do. He contacted law enforcement. The call to authorities on July 19 set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring Charles's month-long deception to an end. But Charles wasn't ready to face the consequences of his actions. When he learned that his son had contacted the police, he fled. This began a manhunt across Behar County as law enforcement agencies mobilized to find Charles Bird. They knew he was dangerous. A man who had killed his wife and concealed her death for over a month was capable of anything. The search involved multiple agencies and stretched throughout the day and into the evening. Meanwhile, the investigation at the mobile home was revealing the full horror of what had transpired. Crime scene investigators worked methodically to document everything, but the scene was so disturbing that even experienced professionals were shaken. The condition of Angela's remains told the story of the past month in vivid, horrific detail. As news of the search began to spread through the community, neighbors and acquaintances struggled to process what they were learning. The man they thought they knew, the husband who had seemed to be dealing with his wife's absence, had actually been the perpetrator of an unimaginable crime. The manhunt for Charles Bird would not last long. Later that evening, as law enforcement closed in, Charles was taken into custody. His month-long flight from reality had finally come to an end. Charles Vandoyle Bird was arrested on the evening of July 20, 2025, bringing an end to the day-long manhunt that had gripped Behar County. When officers took him into custody, they found a man who appeared to be emotionally exhausted, someone who had finally reached the end of his ability to run from what he had done. Initially, Charles was charged with tampering with evidence with intent to impair the investigation of a human corpse, a charge that reflected the specific nature of his crime in concealing Angela's body. But investigators knew this was just the beginning. They needed Charles's confession, they needed the full story, and they needed to build a case that would hold up in court. What happened next in the interview room would provide some of the most disturbing details of an already horrific case. Charles, perhaps realizing that his deception was finally over, began to open up to investigators. But his confession revealed a mindset that was even more chilling than anyone had anticipated. In his recorded interview, Charles made a statement that would become emblematic of his callous attitude toward his crime. When discussing his actions, he told investigators that he wanted to go big or go home with his first offense. This phrase, typically associated with taking bold risks, took on a sinister meaning in the context of murder and concealment of a corpse. The flippancy with which Charles discussed his crime shocked investigators. Here was a man who had killed his wife, lived with her decomposing body for over a month, and was now treating the situation as if it were just another life decision. The psychological profile that emerged from his confession painted a picture of someone who was either completely detached from the reality of his actions or who possessed a level of callousness that defied comprehension. Charles detailed the events of June 16 with a precision that suggested he had relived them many times during the month he spent concealing his crime. He described the argument, his belief that Angela was expecting another man, and the moment when his rage took over. But it was his description of watching Angela die that particularly disturbed investigators. There was no remorse in his voice, no indication that he grasped the magnitude of what he had done. Sheriff Javier Salazar, who oversaw the investigation, would later describe the case as one of the most disturbing he had encountered in his career. The combination of domestic violence, murder, and the month-long concealment created a perfect storm of horror that would stick with everyone involved in the investigation. As Charles's confession continued, investigators learned more about the past month. He described his daily routine, how he had managed to live in the mobile home with Angela's decomposing remains, and how he had maintained his deception with family and friends. The picture that emerged was of a man who had somehow compartmentalized his crime to such an extent that he could function normally while surrounded by the evidence of his horrific act. Following his confession, the legal machinery began to move with increasing momentum. On Wednesday, July 23, 2025, Charles Bird was formally charged with murder in connection with Angela's death. The tampering with evidence charge remained, but now it was accompanied by the more serious charge that reflected the true nature of his crime. Charles was ordered held on a $250,000 bond, a substantial amount that reflected both the severity of his crime and the risk he posed to the community. Along with the bond conditions came restrictions that prohibited him from having any contact with Angela's family and from possessing any firearms. These conditions were standard for someone facing murder charges, but they also served to protect those who might be targets of Charles's anger or desperation. The court proceedings revealed additional disturbing details about Charles's mental state. He had been placed in a suicide smock while in custody, a precautionary measure designed to prevent self-harm. This suggested that Charles was struggling with the reality of his situation, though whether this was genuine remorse or simply fear of the consequences remained unclear. Sheriff Salazar addressed the media throughout the legal proceedings, emphasizing the domestic violence aspect of the case. He pointed out that this was not an isolated incident of violence, but rather the culmination of a pattern of abuse and control that had been building over time. This issue of domestic violence ends like this, Salazar told reporters. It usually ends in a homicide. The sheriff's comments highlighted a tragic reality. Angela Bird's death was not just a random act of violence, but part of a larger pattern of domestic abuse that too often escalates to murder. The isolation of their rural home, Charles's controlling behavior, and his growing paranoia had created a perfect storm that made Angela particularly vulnerable. As the legal case moved forward, the community began to grapple with the reality of what had happened in their midst. The rural area where the Birds lived was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, where crime was relatively rare, and where something like this seemed impossible. The revelation that such a horrific crime had been taking place for over a month, just down the road from their own homes, was deeply unsettling. In the midst of all the horror and legal proceedings, it's important to remember that at the center of this case was a real person, Angela Bird, a 44-year-old woman whose life was cut short in the most tragic way possible. Angela was more than just a victim, she was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's family member. Those who knew her described a woman who was trying to navigate a difficult marriage, someone who deserved so much better than the fate that awaited her on that June night. The isolation that Charles imposed on their relationship meant that many people didn't know the full extent of what Angela was enduring. Domestic violence often thrives in secrecy, with victims cut off from support systems and resources that might help them escape dangerous situations. Angela's rural living situation, combined with Charles's controlling behavior, created the perfect conditions for abuse to escalate without intervention. In domestic violence cases like this one, we often learn after the fact about warning signs that were missed or dismissed. Friends and family members replay conversations and interactions, looking for clues they might have recognized, ways they might have helped. But the reality is that domestic violence is designed to be hidden, and perpetrators like Charles are often skilled at maintaining a facade of normalcy while exercising complete control over their victims behind closed doors. Angela's death serves as a stark reminder of the reality of domestic violence in our society. Every year, thousands of women are killed by intimate partners, and many more live in fear of escalating violence. Angela's story is tragic not just because of how it ended, but because it represents a pattern that plays out far too often in homes across the country. The fact that Charles was able to conceal his crime for over a month also speaks to the isolation that many domestic violence victims experience. Angela had been effectively erased from the world for more than a month before anyone was able to intervene. Her absence, while noticed by some, was explained away by Charles's lies and manipulation. The revelation of what had happened in the Bird home sent shockwaves through the rural Behar County community. In an area where neighbors might be spread far apart but still looked out for each other, the idea that such a horrific crime could go undetected for over a month was deeply disturbing. Local residents struggled to process the news that someone in their community had not only committed murder but had then lived with the evidence of his crime for more than a month. The fact that Charles had continued to move through the community during this time, shopping, interacting with others, maintaining a facade of normalcy, was particularly unsettling. The case also highlighted the challenges of recognizing and responding to domestic violence in rural communities. The isolation that can make rural living appealing also creates opportunities for abuse to escalate without detection. When homes are spread far apart and neighbors have limited contact, warning signs can be missed and cries for help can go unheard. Sheriff Salazar used the case as an opportunity to educate the community about domestic violence warning signs and resources. He emphasized that domestic violence is not just a private family matter, but a community issue that requires everyone to be vigilant and willing to intervene when they suspect someone is in danger. The case also sparked conversations about mental health resources and support systems. While Charles's actions were inexcusable, some in the community wondered if there had been opportunities for intervention before the situation escalated to murder. These conversations, while difficult, were necessary for a community trying to make sense of an incomprehensible tragedy. Even with Charles Bird's confession and formal charges filed, the investigation into Angela's death continued. Law enforcement officials worked to build the strongest possible case for prosecution, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and consulting with experts to ensure that justice would be served. The crime scene investigation was particularly challenging due to the condition of Angela's remains and the contamination that had occurred during the month-long concealment. Forensic experts worked methodically to document everything and preserve evidence that would be crucial in court proceedings. Investigators also worked to establish a timeline of events, not just from June 16 when Angela was killed, but from the weeks and months leading up to the murder. Understanding the dynamics of the relationship between Charles and Angela, the escalation of his controlling behavior, and the warning signs that might have been missed was crucial for building a comprehensive case. The investigation also looked into whether there had been previous incidents of domestic violence in the relationship. Often, murder represents the final escalation in a pattern of abuse that has been building over time. Understanding this pattern was important not just for the prosecution of Charles, but for identifying ways to prevent similar tragedies in the future. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Charles's behavior during the month he spent concealing Angela's death. Investigators worked to understand how he had managed to maintain his deception for so long, what his daily routine had been like, and how he had interacted with others while carrying such a terrible secret. The murder of Angela Bird represents more than just a single act of violence. it's a window into the darker aspects of human nature and the devastating consequences of unchecked jealousy and control. Charles Bird's actions, not just the murder itself, but his month-long concealment of the crime, reveal a level of callousness that challenges our understanding of human behavior. The case also highlights the insidious nature of domestic violence and how it can escalate in isolation. Angela's death was not a sudden, inexplicable act of violence, but rather the culmination of what was likely a long pattern of abuse and control. The rural setting of their home, which might have seemed peaceful and private, became a prison where Angela was trapped with an increasingly dangerous partner. Charles's confession, with its disturbing "go big or go home" comment, suggests a mindset that treated murder and concealment as just another life decision. This level of detachment from the reality of his actions is particularly chilling and speaks to either severe psychological dysfunction or a level of narcissism that prevented him from seeing Angela as a real person deserving of life and dignity. The fact that Charles was able to maintain his deception for over a month also raises questions about our communities and support systems. While his rural living situation provided cover for his crime, it also meant that Angela's absence went unnoticed for far too long. In our increasingly disconnected world, this case serves as a reminder of the importance of staying connected to those around us and being willing to intervene when something seems wrong. The investigation and prosecution of this case will likely continue for months or even years as it moves through the legal system. But regardless of the ultimate outcome in court, the tragedy of Angela Bird's death and the horror of how her body was concealed for over a month will remain as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing and responding to warning signs before it's too late. As this case moves through the legal system, it serves as a catalyst for important conversations about domestic violence prevention and community responsibility. Sheriff Salazar's emphasis on the domestic violence aspects of the case has sparked discussions about resources, warning signs, and intervention strategies that might prevent similar tragedies. The rural community where this tragedy occurred is now grappling with questions about how to better support victims of domestic violence and how to recognize warning signs before situations escalate to murder. These conversations, while difficult, are necessary for creating communities where people like Angela can find help and safety before it's too late. The case also highlights the importance of mental health resources and the need for early intervention when someone exhibits concerning behaviors. While Charles's actions are ultimately his responsibility, some wonder if there were opportunities for intervention that might have prevented this tragedy. For Angela's family and friends, the path forward involves not just seeking justice through the legal system, but also finding ways to remember and honor her life beyond the terrible circumstances of her death. She was more than just a victim, she was a person who deserved to live, to be loved, and to be safe in her own home. The horror of what happened to Angela Bird, not just her murder, but the month-long concealment of her body, will likely haunt everyone involved in this case for years to come. But from this tragedy, perhaps some good can come in the form of increased awareness about domestic violence, better support systems for victims, and a community commitment to watching out for those who might be in danger. As we reflect on this case, we must remember that domestic violence is not just a private family matter, but a community issue that requires all of us to be vigilant, to speak up when we see warning signs, and to support those who are trying to escape dangerous situations. Angela Bird's death was a tragedy that might have been prevented if the right interventions had occurred at the right time. The investigation into her death continues, the legal proceedings move forward, and a community struggles to understand how such horror could unfold in their midst. But Angela's story, tragic as it is, serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of recognizing domestic violence and taking action to prevent it before it escalates to murder. In the quiet of the Texas night, in a rural community still reeling from this tragedy, the questions linger. How do we recognize the warning signs? How do we intervene before it's too late? How do we create communities where people like Angela can find safety and support? These are the questions that Angela Bird's death challenges us to answer. Her life was cut short in the most horrific way, but perhaps her story can serve as a catalyst for change, for better support systems, and for a community commitment to protecting those who are most vulnerable. The case of Angela Bird reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that monsters can live next door, and that the most dangerous place for many women is their own home. But it also reminds us of the importance of community, of watching out for each other, and of never giving up hope that we can do better, that we can create a world where tragedies like this become increasingly rare. Rest in peace, Angela Bird. Your story will not be forgotten, and perhaps, in some small way, it will help prevent others from suffering the same fate. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet mountain town of Woodland Park, Colorado, nestled among the pine-covered slopes of the Rocky Mountains, lived a young woman whose life seemed to embody the American dream. Kelsey Barrett was 29 years old in the autumn of 2018, a flight instructor with dreams as vast as the Colorado sky she navigated daily. She had auburn hair that caught the light when she smiled, and eyes that reflected both determination and gentleness. But beneath the surface of what appeared to be a perfect life, darkness was gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Kelsey had found love, or what she believed to be love, with a local rancher named Patrick Frazee. He was a man who seemed to command respect in their small community, someone who worked the land with his hands and spoke in the measured tones of rural Colorado. They had been together for several years, and their relationship had produced the most precious thing in Kelsey's world, a baby daughter, barely 1 year old, with her mother's bright eyes and her father's stubborn chin. To those who knew her, Kelsey appeared to be living the life she had always wanted. She was a devoted mother who lit up whenever she spoke about her daughter. Her career as a flight instructor fulfilled her love of aviation and her desire to share the wonder of flight with others. She would often speak about the peace she found in the cockpit, high above the world's troubles, where the only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the whisper of wind across the wings. But as Thanksgiving 2018 approached, there were subtle signs that all was not well in Kelsey's world. Those closest to her noticed changes in her demeanor, small shifts in her usual sunny disposition. She had become more withdrawn in recent weeks, though she maintained her professional composure at work and her loving attention to her daughter. If she was worried about something, she kept those concerns largely to herself, as was her nature. Patrick Frazee, meanwhile, was harboring secrets that would soon shatter multiple lives forever. Unknown to Kelsey, he had been maintaining a relationship with another woman, a nurse from Idaho named Crystal Lee Kenny. This wasn't merely an affair, it was a complicated web of manipulation and emotional dependency that had been building for years. Crystal was a married woman with her own child when she first met Patrick in 2015. She later testified that she fell deeply in love with this handsome rancher who seemed to possess an almost magnetic charisma. What began as an extramarital affair evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Patrick had a way of making Crystal feel both desperately needed and utterly disposable, a psychological manipulation that would prove to have deadly consequences. As autumn gave way to the holiday season, Patrick began making increasingly disturbing requests of Crystal. According to her later testimony, he asked her not once, not twice, but 3 separate times to kill Kelsey Barrett. Each request was more specific than the last, more insistent, more threatening. He suggested various methods, including poisoning Kelsey's coffee, as if discussing the weather or planning a weekend trip. Crystal would later claim that she never seriously considered carrying out these requests, but she also never reported them to authorities or warned Kelsey of the danger she was in. Fear, she said, paralyzed her, fear that Patrick would harm her own daughter if she didn't comply with his wishes, and perhaps fear of losing the man she claimed to love despite his increasingly disturbing behavior. Thanksgiving Day 2018 dawned clear and cold in Woodland Park. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that makes Colorado famous, with blue skies stretching endlessly above snow-dusted peaks. For most families, it would be a day of gratitude, of coming together around tables laden with traditional foods, of creating memories that would be treasured for years to come. For Kelsey Barrett, it would be her last day on Earth. The morning proceeded normally enough. Kelsey had plans to exchange their daughter with Patrick, as was their routine. Co-parenting had its challenges, but both seemed committed to ensuring their little girl felt loved and secure despite her parents not being together. Kelsey was seen that morning at a local Safeway grocery store, caught on surveillance cameras as she went about what appeared to be ordinary holiday shopping. She seemed relaxed, moving through the store with the familiar efficiency of a busy mother running errands. The surveillance footage would later become crucial evidence, showing Kelsey alive and apparently unaware of any immediate danger. She purchased items for what might have been a quiet Thanksgiving dinner, perhaps planning to celebrate with her daughter before the child went to stay with Patrick. These mundane images, a young woman selecting groceries, checking her phone, going about the ordinary business of life, would take on haunting significance in the weeks to come. What happened next would be reconstructed months later through the testimony of Crystal Kenny, whose account painted a picture of calculated brutality that shocked even seasoned investigators. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick had orchestrated an elaborate deception to lure Kelsey to her death. He had asked Kelsey to come to her own townhome that afternoon, telling her he had a surprise for her. When she arrived, he suggested they play a game. He wanted her to smell some candles he had supposedly bought for her while wearing a blindfold, to see if she could guess the scents. It was the kind of playful romantic gesture that might have seemed sweet in different circumstances, the sort of thing a loving partner might arrange to bring a smile to someone's face. Kelsey, trusting the father of her child, agreed to this seemingly innocent game. She allowed Patrick to place a blindfold over her eyes and guided her to where the candles were supposedly arranged. It was in this moment of vulnerability, when she was blind and defenseless, that Patrick struck. According to Crystal's testimony, Patrick beat Kelsey to death with a baseball bat, striking her repeatedly in the head while she was helpless to defend herself. Kelsey's final words, as recounted by Crystal, were simply, "Please stop," a heartbreaking plea for mercy that went unheeded. Their infant daughter was somewhere in the house during this horrific attack, though she was apparently not in the immediate vicinity of the violence. The brutality of the crime was almost incomprehensible. This was not a crime of passion, not a momentary loss of control, but a premeditated murder carried out with methodical cruelty. Patrick had planned every detail, from the ruse that brought Kelsey to the house to the blindfold that prevented her from seeing the attack coming. After committing this heinous act, Patrick called Crystal and summoned her from Idaho to help him clean up the crime scene. What she found when she arrived was, by her own description, a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood had splattered across walls and furniture, and the smell of bleach could not entirely mask the metallic scent of violence. Crystal spent hours helping Patrick scrub away evidence of his crime. They cleaned blood from surfaces, disposed of contaminated items, and tried to eliminate any trace of what had occurred in that townhome. It was methodical work, the kind of cleanup that requires both physical stamina and the ability to suppress normal human revulsion at such violence. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the cleanup was its thoroughness. Patrick had clearly thought about this moment, had planned not just the murder but its aftermath. He knew that the crime scene would need to be sanitized, that evidence would need to be destroyed, that Kelsey's body would need to disappear completely. According to testimony, Patrick placed Kelsey's body in a large black tote bag and transported it to a ranch property near Cripple Creek, Colorado. There, he built a fire and burned her remains so completely that no trace of her body would ever be recovered. This final act of destruction was perhaps the cruelest of all, denying Kelsey's family the closure that comes with being able to lay a loved one to rest. But even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces, and Patrick's began to unravel almost immediately. The first red flag came from Kelsey's phone, which began sending text messages after she had disappeared. These messages, supposedly from Kelsey herself, claimed that she was going away for a while and not to worry about her. But something about the messages felt wrong to those who knew her well. The texts didn't sound like Kelsey. The phrasing was off, the tone was uncharacteristic, and most telling of all, she would never have voluntarily separated from her infant daughter for any extended period. Those who knew Kelsey understood that her daughter was the center of her universe, and she would never have simply disappeared without making arrangements for the child's care. 3 days after Kelsey was last seen alive, a coworker received one of these suspicious text messages. The message claimed that Kelsey had gotten a new job and would not be returning to work. This immediately raised alarms, as Kelsey had given no indication to anyone that she was considering leaving her position as a flight instructor. She loved her job and had never mentioned being dissatisfied with her work. Family members became increasingly concerned when Kelsey failed to respond to calls and texts. This was completely unlike her, as she was known for staying in regular contact with loved ones, especially her mother. The family's worry intensified when they realized that no one had heard from Kelsey since Thanksgiving Day. 10 days after she was last seen, Kelsey's family officially reported her missing to the Woodland Park Police Department. The investigation began immediately, and investigators quickly focused their attention on Patrick Frazee. As the father of Kelsey's child and the person who had reportedly been with her on the day she disappeared, he was naturally someone they needed to speak with. Patrick's behavior during the early stages of the investigation was telling. He appeared calm and collected, almost detached from the situation. When questioned about Kelsey's whereabouts, he claimed that she had simply left, abandoning their daughter to pursue some new opportunity. This explanation didn't sit well with investigators or with anyone who knew Kelsey personally. The investigation took on new urgency when it became clear that Kelsey's cell phone had been moved hundreds of miles away from Colorado. Digital forensics revealed that the phone had been in Idaho, specifically in an area where someone might dispose of evidence. This discovery led investigators to focus their attention beyond Colorado's borders. Meanwhile, Patrick continued to act as though Kelsey had simply chosen to disappear. He filed for custody of their daughter, claiming that Kelsey had abandoned the child. This legal maneuvering seemed callous to those who knew how devoted Kelsey had been to her daughter. The idea that she would willingly leave her baby behind was simply incomprehensible to anyone who had witnessed the bond between mother and child. As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture began to emerge of the complicated relationships surrounding Kelsey's disappearance. Investigators learned about Crystal Kenny and began to understand the triangle of relationships that had preceded the crime. They discovered that Patrick had been leading a double life, maintaining relationships with both women while neither fully understood the extent of his deception. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators were able to trace Kelsey's cell phone to Idaho and ultimately to Crystal Kenny. When confronted with evidence linking her to the disposal of the phone, Crystal began to crack under pressure. She initially tried to deny any involvement, but the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with the possibility of being charged with murder herself, Crystal made a decision that would ultimately lead to Patrick's conviction. She agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge of tampering with evidence. This cooperation meant she would have to testify against Patrick, revealing the full horror of what had occurred on Thanksgiving Day 2018. The decision to cooperate was not easy for Crystal. She was, by her own admission, still in love with Patrick despite everything that had happened. But the weight of her involvement in covering up Kelsey's murder, combined with the prosecutor's evidence against her, left her with little choice. In December 2018, Patrick Frazee was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, solicitation to commit murder, and tampering with a deceased body. The charges painted a picture of a man who had not only killed Kelsey himself but had repeatedly tried to convince someone else to do it for him. The solicitation charges were particularly damning, as they showed that this was not a spontaneous act of violence but a carefully planned murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the small community of Woodland Park. Patrick had been known as a local rancher, someone who seemed to be a solid member of the community. The revelation that he had allegedly committed such a brutal crime against the mother of his child was almost impossible for some residents to accept. As the case moved toward trial, more disturbing details emerged. Investigators learned that Patrick had not only planned Kelsey's murder but had also considered eliminating other potential witnesses. According to testimony from a fellow inmate, Patrick had discussed creating a hit list of people who might testify against him, including Crystal Kenny herself. This revelation showed the depth of Patrick's narcissism and his willingness to continue committing violence to protect himself. It also demonstrated that Kelsey's murder was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of manipulative and dangerous behavior that might have continued if he had not been caught. The trial began in November 2019, nearly a year after Kelsey's disappearance. The courtroom was packed with family members, reporters, and community members who had been following the case. The prosecution faced the challenging task of proving murder without a body, relying heavily on Crystal's testimony and the digital evidence surrounding Kelsey's cell phone. Crystal's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Over several days, she recounted the horrifying details of what Patrick had told her about the murder and what she had witnessed when she came to help clean up the crime scene. Her description of finding blood splattered throughout Kelsey's townhome painted a vivid picture of the violence that had occurred there. The testimony was emotionally devastating for everyone in the courtroom, particularly Kelsey's family members who were hearing these details for the first time. The image of their beloved daughter and sister being brutally beaten to death while blindfolded was almost too horrible to comprehend. Yet they sat through every word, determined to see justice done for Kelsey. Crystal also testified about the 3 times Patrick had asked her to kill Kelsey, providing insight into his long-term planning and his attempts to avoid committing the crime himself. She described how he had suggested various methods, including poisoning Kelsey's coffee, showing the calculated nature of his planning. Perhaps most heartbreaking was Crystal's account of Kelsey's final words, "Please stop." This simple plea for mercy illustrated Kelsey's helplessness in her final moments and the complete absence of compassion in her killer. These words would haunt everyone who heard them and serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of Patrick's actions. The defense attempted to discredit Crystal's testimony, pointing out that she had initially lied to investigators and had participated in covering up the crime. They argued that her testimony was unreliable because she had made a deal with prosecutors to avoid more serious charges. However, the prosecution was able to corroborate many details of her account through physical evidence and witness testimony. Throughout the trial, Patrick maintained his innocence, even as the evidence against him mounted. He showed little emotion as the gruesome details of Kelsey's murder were recounted, leading many observers to comment on his apparent lack of remorse or empathy. The trial also revealed the extent of Patrick's manipulation of both women in his life. Evidence showed that he had told different stories to Kelsey and Crystal about their relationships, keeping each woman partially in the dark about his involvement with the other. This pattern of deception and manipulation was consistent with the calculated way he had planned and carried out Kelsey's murder. After several weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberation process was relatively quick, suggesting that the evidence against Patrick was overwhelming. The jury found Patrick guilty on all counts, including first-degree felony murder and 3 counts of solicitation to commit murder. He was sentenced to life without parole plus 156 years, the maximum possible sentence. The verdict brought some measure of closure to Kelsey's family, though nothing could truly heal the wound left by her loss. In victim impact statements, family members spoke about the vibrant young woman whose life had been cut short, about the daughter who would grow up without her mother, and about the ripple effects of this senseless violence. Kelsey's mother spoke about the granddaughter she was now raising, about trying to keep Kelsey's memory alive for a child who would have no memories of her own mother. She described the daily struggle of grief, the way it changed everything about how she experienced the world. She also spoke about forgiveness, though she made it clear that forgiveness did not mean excusing or forgetting what had been done. The case also had significant implications for Crystal Kenny, who had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. She pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence and was initially sentenced to 3 years in prison, though this sentence was later reduced. Her cooperation had been essential to securing Patrick's conviction, but it came at great personal cost. Crystal's role in the case raised difficult questions about complicity and moral responsibility. While she had not committed the murder herself, her failure to warn Kelsey or contact authorities when Patrick first asked her to kill Kelsey had arguably contributed to the tragedy. Her decision to help clean up the crime scene and dispose of evidence had further implicated her in the cover-up. Some viewed Crystal as another victim of Patrick's manipulation, arguing that she had been psychologically controlled and threatened into compliance. Others felt that as an adult woman, she bore responsibility for her choices and should have done more to prevent Kelsey's death or to ensure that justice was served more quickly. The truth, as is often the case in complex criminal matters, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Crystal was both a victim of manipulation and someone who made choices that had tragic consequences. Her testimony ultimately helped convict Kelsey's killer, but it came only after Kelsey was already dead and could not be saved. The investigation into Kelsey's murder also revealed important lessons about domestic violence and the warning signs of dangerous relationships. While Patrick and Kelsey were not married and did not live together, their relationship exhibited many of the control patterns that characterize abusive partnerships. Patrick's ability to manipulate two different women simultaneously, his requests for Crystal to commit murder, and his ultimate decision to kill Kelsey himself all pointed to a pattern of escalating control and violence. The case served as a reminder that domestic violence can occur in many different relationship configurations and that the most dangerous time for victims is often when they try to leave or establish independence. For the small community of Woodland Park, the case was a devastating reminder that violence can intrude into even the most peaceful settings. The town had prided itself on being a safe place to raise families, a quiet mountain community where neighbors looked out for one another. The revelation that such a brutal crime had occurred in their midst shattered some residents' sense of security. The case also highlighted the challenges law enforcement faces in investigating crimes where the victim's body is never recovered. Without physical remains, prosecutors had to build their case entirely on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and digital forensics. The successful conviction in this case demonstrated both the skill of the investigators and the power of modern forensic techniques. Digital evidence played a crucial role in solving Kelsey's murder. The tracking of her cell phone's movement from Colorado to Idaho provided investigators with the thread they needed to unravel the conspiracy. Text messages sent from the phone after Kelsey's death helped establish a timeline and revealed the attempts to create a false narrative about her disappearance. The case also showed how social media and digital communications can provide both opportunities and challenges for criminals. While Patrick and Crystal were able to communicate and coordinate their cover-up activities through digital means, these same communications ultimately provided evidence against them. As the legal proceedings concluded and Patrick began serving his life sentence, questions remained about what had driven him to commit such a heinous crime. Mental health experts who followed the case noted patterns consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and psychopathy, but no definitive diagnosis was ever made public. What seemed clear was that Patrick had viewed Kelsey not as a person with her own rights and desires, but as an obstacle to be removed. His willingness to kill the mother of his child, to traumatize their daughter by making her an orphan, and to destroy multiple families showed a profound lack of empathy and human connection. The ripple effects of Kelsey's murder continued long after the trial ended. Her daughter, now being raised by loving family members, would grow up with the knowledge that her father had killed her mother. The extended families on both sides were left to grapple with the aftermath of violence that had torn through their lives like a tornado. For those who had known and loved Kelsey, the challenge was finding ways to honor her memory while dealing with the trauma of her loss. Friends and family established scholarships in her name, focusing on aviation education to reflect her passion for flight. These efforts helped ensure that Kelsey's love of flying and her desire to share that passion with others would continue to inspire future generations. The case also prompted discussions about how to better identify and intervene in potentially dangerous relationships. Domestic violence advocates pointed to Patrick's pattern of manipulation and control as warning signs that might have been recognized and addressed before they escalated to murder. Educational programs were developed to help people recognize the signs of manipulation and coercive control in relationships. These programs emphasized that domestic violence is not always physical and that psychological abuse can be just as damaging and dangerous as physical violence. For law enforcement agencies, the case provided valuable lessons about investigating complex crimes involving multiple jurisdictions and digital evidence. The cooperation between Colorado and Idaho authorities was crucial to solving the case, and their work together served as a model for other multi-state investigations. The successful prosecution also demonstrated the importance of victim advocates and support services for families dealing with violent crimes. Kelsey's family had to navigate not only their grief but also the complex legal system, media attention, and the ongoing trauma of learning horrific details about their loved one's death. As time passed, the immediate media attention surrounding the case faded, but the impact on those directly affected continued. Kelsey's family faced the ongoing challenge of raising her daughter while dealing with their own grief and trauma. They worked to create a loving, stable environment for the little girl while also preserving memories of her mother. The child, now growing up without her mother, represents both the greatest tragedy of this case and its most important legacy. In her smile, family members see glimpses of Kelsey. In her laughter, they hear echoes of the joy that Kelsey brought to the world. Ensuring that this little girl grows up knowing how much her mother loved her has become a sacred mission for those who survive. Patrick Frazie's conviction and sentencing marked the end of the legal proceedings, but for many, it was just the beginning of a long journey toward healing. The criminal justice system had done its job by holding the perpetrator accountable, but it could not restore what had been lost or undo the trauma that had been inflicted. Despite the conviction, Kelsey's body has never been found, and investigators have said they will never stop looking for her. This ongoing search represents more than just professional dedication. It reflects the human need for closure and the belief that every person deserves a proper burial. The absence of remains also means that Kelsey's family has never been able to hold a traditional funeral or visit a gravesite. Instead, they have had to find other ways to honor her memory and process their grief. Memorial services, scholarship funds, and annual remembrances have helped fill this void, but they can never fully replace the comfort that comes from having a physical place to mourn and remember. For Crystal Kenny, life after the trial has meant living with the consequences of her choices and the knowledge of her role in the tragedy. After serving her reduced sentence and being released from prison, she has largely remained out of the public eye. The psychological burden of what she witnessed and participated in will likely be something she carries for the rest of her life. The case has also had lasting implications for how law enforcement approaches crimes involving digital evidence and interstate conspiracies. The techniques used to track Kelsey's cell phone and piece together the timeline of events have been refined and shared with other agencies facing similar challenges. Training programs for investigators now include lessons learned from the Barrett case, particularly regarding the importance of quickly identifying and following digital trails. The case demonstrated that even when physical evidence is destroyed, digital footprints can provide crucial information about what occurred and who was involved. For domestic violence prevention advocates, Kelsey's story has become a powerful tool for education and awareness. Her case illustrates how quickly controlling behavior can escalate to lethal violence and how manipulation can prevent victims from recognizing their danger or seeking help. The fact that Patrick had asked Crystal multiple times to kill Kelsey before ultimately doing it himself shows the premeditated nature of domestic violence murders. This challenges the common misconception that such crimes are typically crimes of passion committed in the heat of the moment. Educational materials developed in the wake of Kelsey's murder emphasize the importance of recognizing manipulation and coercive control as forms of abuse that can be just as dangerous as physical violence. They also stress the importance of trusting instincts and seeking help when relationships feel wrong, even if there are no obvious signs of physical abuse. The case has also contributed to ongoing discussions about plea bargaining and cooperation agreements in criminal cases. Crystal's deal with prosecutors was controversial, with some arguing that she should have faced more serious charges for her role in the cover-up. Others contended that her cooperation was essential to securing a conviction and that the reduced sentence was justified by her assistance to the prosecution. These debates reflect broader questions about how the justice system should handle cases where multiple people are involved in serious crimes but bear different levels of responsibility. The challenge is balancing the need to hold all participants accountable with the practical necessity of sometimes offering reduced sentences to secure cooperation against the primary perpetrator. In the years since Patrick's conviction, there have been occasional legal developments related to the case. Appeals have been filed and rejected, and there have been minor adjustments to Crystal's sentence. However, the fundamental facts of the case and the justice of the outcome have remained unchanged. The story of Kelsey Barrett serves as a stark reminder of how quickly lives can be shattered by violence and how the consequences of one person's evil choices can ripple through families and communities for generations. It also demonstrates the dedication of law enforcement professionals who work tirelessly to seek justice for victims and their families. Perhaps most importantly, Kelsey's story reminds us of the preciousness of life and the importance of cherishing the people we love. In the midst of darkness and tragedy, the memories of Kelsey's kindness, her passion for flying, and her devotion to her daughter serve as lights that continue to shine. Her family and friends work daily to ensure that Kelsey is remembered not primarily as a victim of violence, but as a vibrant young woman who brought joy and love into the world. They want her daughter to know that she came from love, that her mother's life had meaning and purpose beyond the tragic way it ended. The aviation community, in particular, has worked to honor Kelsey's memory through scholarships and educational programs that reflect her passion for flight. These initiatives ensure that her love of flying continues to inspire others to pursue their dreams and reach for the sky, just as she did. As we reflect on this tragic case, we are reminded of the importance of speaking up when we see signs of abuse or manipulation in relationships around us. We are reminded of the value of supporting law enforcement and victim advocacy programs that work to prevent violence and seek justice when prevention fails. Most of all, we are reminded that behind every true crime story is a real person who was loved, who had dreams and hopes and fears, who mattered to someone. Kelsey Barrett was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a mother, a friend, a professional who loved what she did and brought joy to others through her work. Her story is ultimately about loss, the loss of a life full of potential, the loss of a mother's love for her child, the loss of dreams that will never be fulfilled. But it is also about love, the love of family members who refused to let her be forgotten, the love of a community that came together to seek justice, and the enduring love between a mother and daughter that death itself cannot destroy. In the quiet moments of the night, when the world settles into stillness and we are left alone with our thoughts, we might remember Kelsey Barrett not as the victim of a horrible crime, but as a reminder to hold our loved ones close, to speak words of kindness while we can, and to never take for granted the precious gift of another day. The mountains around Woodland Park still stand tall and majestic, unchanged by human tragedy. The skies that Kelsey once navigated with such joy continue to stretch endlessly above, offering the same sense of freedom and possibility that drew her to aviation. In some small way, perhaps her spirit continues to soar among those peaks and through those boundless skies, free at last from the darkness that cut her earthly journey short. And somewhere in Colorado, a little girl is growing up surrounded by love, carrying within her the best parts of a mother she will never remember but whose love for her was so profound that it transcends death itself. In that child's laughter, in her curiosity about the world, in her capacity for joy despite the tragedy that shadows her story, Kelsey Barrett's legacy lives on. This is the story we remember as we drift toward sleep, not just a tale of violence and betrayal, but a reminder of love's enduring power and the human spirit's remarkable ability to find light even in the deepest darkness. In remembering Kelsey, we honor not just her life, but the preciousness of all life and the responsibility we all share to protect and cherish one another. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.